everybody, welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello, Scott.
Josh, my friend, the big crazy mad frog times continue to flow through. It seems like there's another acquisition in the works, even though when you actually drill down to the reality of what's being said, it's airy-fairy all over the place. So it's you take this whole thing with a pinch of bucket, a large helping of salt, because as much as it makes sense, and we'll get into why it makes sense, it's not fully confirmed yet. So the crux of this thing is the idea of Sony buying Capcom as a follow-up to Sony buying Bungie, which was something that only broke last night over in UK time. But the Capcom thing comes from Jeff Grubb, the man himself, the dude from VentureBeat, the guy that's constantly leaking all sorts of different things, where over on his Jeff Grubb's Game Mess podcast, he was discussing this stuff and talking about the fact that him and Mike Mignotti had heard that there were other acquisitions in the works. Something big is what was coming, but they said they obviously couldn't talk about it, they couldn't detail it. And then he said, well, it takes two to tango. And the thing was, that seemed to be a reference to the overall acquisition or the general conversation between Bungie and Sony. However, a lot of people have taken that quote and realized that it is a name of an achievement in Resident Evil 5, therefore pointing to the idea that Sony are actually acquiring Capcom, that they are the big deal, they're the big acquisition that's yet to come. And like I said at the beginning, it would make a lot of sense. He did clarify that this wasn't in regards to Hazelight, the makers of It Takes Two. He also clarified that it's not in regards to Take-Two, the parent company of Rockstar, that it is just, he didn't clarify it any more than just saying that statement and then saying what it was not. So it's kind of just up in the air. But like I said, it is an achievement in Resident Evil 5, which is kind of a Jeff Grubb thing to do. If you're going to point at something in regards to an acquisition, it has a fun, leaky style way to point at that. However, before I pass it over to you, it is worth noting that Street Fighter 5 was PlayStation exclusive. Sony have a very solid relationship with Capcom, as they do with various Japanese developers. Street Fighter 5 PlayStation exclusive, Monster Hunter World's beta was entirely PlayStation exclusive, and there's a rumor doing the rounds that future Resident Evil games will start as PlayStation exclusives as well, with the Resident Evil 4 remake being one of them. But what do you make of the whole thing?
Well, first off, Scott Tilford, I think I would not like to be Jeff Grubb, because everything that man says is sort of scrutinized with a level of kind of obsessiveness that it just kind of leads to wild rumors like this. And I don't necessarily think he was hinting towards that, but like you said, they were talking about an acquisition. We know that more acquisitions are coming from Sony. Jim Ryan have confirmed that. So while I don't think this was like a major hint towards that or confirms it in that way, I do think Capcom makes sense because of the reasons that you said there. You know, Capcom has some of the fan favorite franchises like right now, and they're in a better place than they've ever been in terms of their relationship with the customer, you know, and fans. They have turned things around from the early 2010s when they were mired in all sorts of controversy for on-disc DLC, for Resident Evil 6 being a complete trash fire, for, you know, just a bunch of dodgy decisions business-wise and creatively. And they've turned that around. You know, they've released Resident Evil 2, they've released Devil May Cry 5. Monster Hunter is bigger than it's ever been and arguably better than it's ever been.
Yes.
So they're in a good position now that if Sony were to acquire them, not only would they be getting all of these franchises that they do have relationships with already, like you said, you know, Monster Hunter exclusivity. Resident Evil has a history tied to PlayStation. They're also getting a company arguably in its prime, in its most lovable form yet. It's not taking on a company with a lot of baggage like Microsoft did with Activision, you know, where they've got to have to work to turn that company around from being a toxic environment to being a healthy environment that has a positive, you know, public face. Like Capcom is already in prime position to kind of benefit Sony's image, in my opinion, and that's why I think that they would definitely be a target alongside a few others that I want to talk about. But yeah, for me, a Capcom thing, even though I don't necessarily think this rumor is, you know, pointing to that in a concrete way, I do think it would make sense as an acquisition target.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. A lot of people, taking that one little quote and running with it. But the one thing that he does say more concretely is that they have heard there is another acquisition coming. So there's something else in the water overall. It's worth reminding people that the Bungie acquisition started being talked about 5 to 6 months ago, according to the various reports that are doing the rounds now. It was very much not a direct response to the Activision acquisition from Microsoft. Yeah. So it seems like Sony have been planning something like this for, I guess, like half a year ago. And this is potentially them about to spring this on everybody. Because they did, acquire House mark. They have done other acquisitions recently. It seems like they are planning for the generation ahead. And like I've said, Capcom makes sense. I wonder how much Sony potentially look to doing this sort of Japanese alliance of video game studios, because a lot of the rumors that were doing the rounds was that they would acquire Square Enix, obviously Final Fantasy. It's the Final Fantasy VII's 25th anniversary this year, so if they did something like that, there's a lot of PR stuff they can get on board with. Announcing Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, keeping it PlayStation exclusive because Part 1 still hasn't made it to its Xbox. There's stuff they can do with where the Square Enix brand is at. And also there's the likes of Atlas, there's Konami. There was so many rumors about Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid being put together. Hideo Kojima could potentially work on them if they knitted those other facets together to actually acquire Konami. There's a lot of things that make sense on paper. If it's all just moving chess pieces around the board and just having fun with the potential of what could be, some stuff lines up with it making more sense than others.
For me, the Square Enix one, right, like that's the one that makes the most sense, because you look at Square Enix as a company, and while they have a lot of talented developers, while they have IP that still sells really well, they're like chronically disappointed with their games, especially their Western developed games. They're always talking about how things just didn't hit their expectations. Tomb Raider didn't hit their expectations, The Avengers didn't hit their expectations, Deus Ex didn't hit their expectations, and it's like, are they looking to sell? What do they want out of the video game industry? What are they trying to hit? Because it's clear over the past decade or so of them constantly releasing these failed expectations that they don't really get it, that they don't really know.
They almost killed themselves with the Avengers. There was they almost went completely under because the amount of money it cost them to put the Avengers together. That game bombed to such a degree that it almost killed them entirely. They were saved by the Final Fantasy VII Remake and the amount of money that made. So it's like they're playing stuff very close to the chest. It's some of the biggest corporate bets that they could do with some of the most boring game design that you could put out there. That on a corporate level you could argue like, well, of course this is going to sell. Of course this is going to work. But as a way to run a company, it's not very stable. And their last few years have been notably up and down. And even like something like Dragon Quest went on very well. Going forward, there's Final Fantasy 16 and Forspoken that are already PlayStation exclusive. Even if they end up being timed exclusives, they still have that working relationship with Sony and with the PlayStation brand. So why not cash in on that? If you're the corporate side of it, if you're the shareholders, whatever, then it potentially makes sense for them to shack up with Sony. I know that that's not what's directly, well, it's potentially what's being talked about because they would be a big deal. It would make waves if Sony acquired Square Enix, considering how much of a relationship they had in the 90s as well.
That's it. I mean, we can sit here and we can talk about them potentially buying EA, potentially buying Ubisoft, but I feel like Square Enix, Capcom, Konami are just more in the realm of realism because of the things you've just said there, and the fact that Square Enix in particular, like they've relied on exclusivity and people like Microsoft and Sony to pay the bills before. Rise of the Tomb Raider, famously a Xbox One exclusive, like you said there. Final Fantasy 16, Forspoken, Final Fantasy 7 Remake. Like there's relationships there already. They're already definitely eager to, allow these game console makers to come in and give them some resources, give them some money to help make these games, because they don't want to risk the financials of having another thing come in and be disappointing, be underwhelming, not hit their sales targets. So it's like, if you're already in that zone, if you're already making so many of these deals, these third-party deals, like to me, that's them kind of almost wanting to get out the game anyway. If they've already got a foot out the door, I feel like they would be a target that's like more willing to sell than maybe a Capcom who might be more confident in what they have.
That's the thing. I mean, I saw, again, it was Jeff Grove tweeting about what happened in the early 2010s, why Konami became so left field. And there's a whole conversation around that was happening in the early 2010s about the idea that consoles were done, PCs were about to take off, mobile gaming was about to become the next big thing. And a lot of companies thought that. That's why we had such a delay to getting big games, because it took so long to fire up the ovens again, let's say, whilst they realized that people did care about consoles. And all of a sudden the PS4 was selling insane numbers again. So it becomes this whole thing where, we've seen what it looks like when everybody goes third party, when they try and experiment with the changing terrain of the way that the 2010s played out. And, like I just said, they bet the entire house on the Avengers. They've tried all these different projects. They're disappointed, like you said, in so many IP. They even let IO Interactive leave with the Hitman IP because they didn't think it had any worth to it. So they were happy for them to leave when they left the company. And obviously just look what Hitman's been able to do now. So they've made a lot of wrong decisions, I would say. It's on the company level, the corporate level, the financial level. And those are reasons why Square Square Enix would make sense under the Sony umbrella. There's obviously the whole wider conversation to be had about whether or not acquisition of studios overall is a good thing. But I could largely fundamentally say that a solo operating Square Enix has not been as good as when they were more closely tied to a console manufacturer as they were in the 90s. So maybe the last 20 years has been this insane experiment, and it's not that we haven't had anything good come from it, but like you said, they keep falling back on the fact that they aren't personally satisfied, which is also the word from internally as well. So yeah, they make just as much sense as a Capcom to me.
Totally. I mean, you have like these great franchises that they just let die. Like you said, you know, like, they let Hitman go. Yeah. Deus Ex wasn't interesting at them all, so we got the last Deus Ex game, which was literally, allegedly, if you read the reports, a big game that was split in two because they wanted something quicker. You know, we've got Tomb Raider that's just kind of
the third one as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they've taken them off. Now they're working on Marvel stuff. You know, we have Tomb Raider, one of the biggest gaming franchises of all time, that was just allowed to just die a death over the last generation, where the games themselves were all right, but there was no real fanfare around them. They didn't really hit the cultural vein in the same way that Tomb Raider should, you know what I mean? So you've got all of these franchises, quite similarly to Konami, that are just there, ready to be plucked, ready to be transformed, ready to be reinvigorated. And Square Enix, for me, over the past decade, over the past 2 decades, have shown they're not really the people to do those specific franchises justice. Like you said, there's still good games that have come out of Square Enix, I'm not saying that, but they've made more mistakes than they've had successes, in my opinion.
4 words: Final Fantasy Battle Royale. That's one of the things that they're trying to hook everything back onto. So yeah, it's we started the video talking about Capcom. Obviously, I think that like both Capcom and Square Enix make just as much sense of each other. I would also look at Konami because there's the potential of those rumors. There's the idea that they could, or they are in need of saving overall as a company. You know, something like a PlayStation-backed Castlevania with the amount of budget that Sony could put behind it would be incredible. So there are viable things that could be this big acquisition that Grubb and Mignoti are talking about. But let us know what you think down in the comments below. What do you think of this weird era of acquisitions that we're in, and is that who you want Sony to shack up with next? For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Don't play Killzone.